With that, we should be live. Hey, folks, people
Hopefully
from the
we are
internet,
live.
welcome aboard. Flynn, how's it going? What are we talking about
Jason,
today?
we're talking about mesh expansion with Linkerd.
Are you
And you can
saying
see my slides, right?
Linkerd going beyond the Kubernetes cluster?
That is exactly what I am saying,
Oh
in
my
fact.
God. Tell me
It's pretty
more.
cool. Let me get into the slides. We don't actually have a lot of slides today. This is a couple of slides setting the stage. We're going to go into a demo. And I think I said this when I did this for Cloud Native Live. This is one of those demos where the chances of things blowing up in our faces is rather larger today than it normally is, because this is easily the most complex setup I've ever demoed. So, everybody cross your fingers and pray to the demo gods, or, whatever you think is appropriate, and off we go.
Well, before we go too far into that, can we recommend to folks, if you're interested in following along or you have questions, come join the workshops channel at the Linkerd Slack. And there's a link down there, but it's slack.linkerd.io to get invited to the Linkerd Slack Slack workspace. And then we'd love to hear from you there.
Yeah. I will warn you, Jason, that unlike many days, I cannot see Slack on my screen right now because I don't dare change anything by going to drag the Slack window onto it. So I'm just going to let you, be my Slack whisperer here today.
All right, on it.
Yeah, I'm also going to point out that we will be pushing the source for this repo either later today or tomorrow morning, but it's not up yet. So following along is probably going to be a little bit challenging right now, but I think we're showing enough stuff. I think we're showing enough that you can probably, make some progress there.
Excellent.
Okay.
One more thing. Sorry, Flynn, to keep interrupting you. This will be
No,
the
we're
last
not.
one more thing, I swear. Folks, if you're watching, we'd love to hear where you're from. If you'd post that in chat. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. Flynn, I think you're in Boston. Is that right?
A little bit outside Boston.
A little bit outside Boston. Great. And everybody else, we'd love to hear where you're from. You've got a bunch of different chat options. So if you're in YouTube or Twitch, they've got little chat threads there, and we'll try our best to read it. And I guess, again, the best, most reliable way is to hop over into the workshops channel on the Linkerd Slack. Sorry, Flynn, now you can go ahead.
I am, by Boston standards, I'm way out in the burbs, which means that from my house to downtown Boston is 7 miles as the crow flies. Way out in the Boston's weird. All right. So with that out of the way, we are starting something new. We're going to do our first one in March. We're doing the Buoyant Brown Bag B Cubed sessions. These are very small hands-on workshops. It is very important that you go to the wait list and sign up for this so that you get a spot, because we will be, I don't actually remember how many we're going to be limiting it to, but it's a very, very small thing so that we can go very, very deep and make sure that everybody can, gets everything working and all that. So this should be kind of fun. I'm looking forward to these. So again, if you are interested, then go to the wait list. Do that immediately. Do not wait. Waitlist early or something like that.
Early
the
and
first
often.
one, yeah, I guess early and often works. I don't. Yeah. The first one that we're going to be doing is on Hazel, which is coming in Linkerd 2.15, I guess. Hazel's really cool. Hazel is a way that you can set things up so that if you have a cluster that spans multiple zones, then Linkerd will automatically keep your traffic in zone as much as is possible, but still allow it to go out of zone if something goes wrong and it needs to bring in workloads in other zones so that things don't go down. It's really cool. All right. And of course, we still have the Zero Trust Reference Architecture ebook open. Or up for download rather. You can go ahead and pull that down. We think it's pretty cool. And with that, a little bit about mesh expansion and then dive into the demo. Jason stole a little bit of my thunder by saying this is talking about how you go, past the mesh. But this is going to be up there in the Service Mesh Academy repo. It's not up there yet. And I would love to tell you that it's not up there yet for some beautiful reason, but the truth is it's not up because it wasn't working about 2 hours ago. So yeah, you remember when I said you should pray to the demo gods? Pray to the demo gods, please. I would really appreciate that. Also, that slide was wrong. We're actually using Edge 24.2.2 because that's the most recent Edge. Okay, mesh expansion. It's basically you want workloads that are not in your Kubernetes cluster to be able to participate in the mesh. That's all there is to it. It's a very easy thing to say. It is a very not easy thing, it turns out, to do. I'm talking about the implementation, not so much the work that we are doing in the demo. This will be in Linkerd 2.15, which will be coming out soon, TM. And this is basically what it looks like, where if you have a cluster, this is your normal Linkerd thing where you've got the Linkerd proxy running by all your workloads inside your cluster. And when we talk about mesh expansion, we are talking about moving some of those so that they are no longer in your Kubernetes cluster, but they still have a Linkerd proxy running. Some limitations right now is that, limitations are no big deal. We are only supporting Linux external workloads right now. Oh, that's fascinating. That animation is out of order now. See, this is what happens when the demo takes a long time to get working, is I don't have a chance to go through the slides and then I look really stupid presenting. The great thing about being able to do the mesh expansion is that it gives you access to workloads that can't run in the cluster. Maybe they're old legacy things that have simply never been ported into Kubernetes. Maybe they're running on very small devices so that it doesn't make sense. You want to have something that's scattered around your factory floor with instrumentation on it. And these are things that are wins for doing this. Jason, did you unmute because you're about to interrupt me again?
Yes. Yeah, I'm super curious. So this means with my Linkerd proxy running on my Linux machine, whether it's physical or virtual, does that proxy get to act like a member of the mesh?
Yeah, 100%. That's the point.
So MTLS, all that goodness,
all that good stuff. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Fantastic.
The way that we implemented this, and by we, I mean the people within Buoyant who work in engineering and did all the hard work of making this work, is pretty much that you do the same thing that you would do in Kubernetes. You run a Linkerd proxy with your workload, and then you go and beat on IP tables so that your proxy gets to take over the network traffic, even though it's not running in Kubernetes. The kind of interesting thing about this is that in a lot of ways, this boils down to doing by hand a bunch of things that Kubernetes kind of does for you. And that's what makes it difficult. There are 3 challenges into this whole endeavor. The first one is within a Kubernetes cluster, we get to rely on service accounts to provide a basis for identity for MTLS and things like that. We don't have that if we're not running in Kubernetes. And so when we're running outside of Kubernetes, we actually are using SPIFFE IDs for this instead of using Kubernetes service accounts. One note, at present, you cannot use SPIFFE IDs for workloads running inside the cluster, which candidly made me a little bit sad, but I get it. Hopefully that'll happen soon, sometime later. We have challenges around the network and DNS. Obviously, your workloads running in outside the cluster need to be able to talk to things inside the cluster, but there's a really interesting piece of that, which is DNS. If your workload running outside the cluster wants to talk to a workload running inside the cluster, it's going to try to resolve a name like, service.namespace.service. or workload.namespace.service.cluster.local, and it has to be able to resolve that for things to work. Likewise, inside the cluster, you need something to refer to be able to figure out how to talk to this external workload. And so that gets a little bit interesting as well.
Flynn, we have our first question. So how small is a small device? Like in your example, what are you using?
Let me get to that later.
Okay.
But the answer is pretty small. Don't think small like an ESP32, but small like a Raspberry Pi is fine. So
great.
The proxy itself doesn't really take a lot of resources. As I said, we do assume Linux. That's another reason why you can't run on something like an ESP32 or some similar really, really tiny embedded device. Although over the last week or so, Sometimes, I don't know if you ever get this feeling, Jason, but sometimes I end up looking around at what's available and going, man, it's pretty cool. We're living in the future. So a thing that I found out exists right now is you can buy a $120 FPGA board where you can just load a RISC-V CPU into the FPGA and then run Linux on it.
Okay.
And have room left over in the FPGA to do your own custom hardware around the edges of it, which is like totally living in the future. So I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of tempted to grab one of those and then try to run the Linkerd proxy on that. I mean, I don't think I'm going to do that anytime soon, but it would be really cool.
Hopefully not today.
No, the biggest reason I wouldn't do it today is that the ones that I saw for $120 actually don't have any sort of network connection. So anyway, all right. You have any other questions before we go hop into demo land?
So far, everything looks clear. But folks, if you do have questions, please pop them in chat or pop them in the Slack channel, and I'll be sure to relay them to Flynn.
Sounds good. All right. So let's see what happens. Well, so the first thing that happens is that you get to see jumping ahead to something that you shouldn't have seen because I forgot to edit a script. But fine. I guess I'll just, end up revealing to everybody early that there's a Raspberry Pi running a bunch of stuff right now. All right, let's go back to the actual start of the demo. Since I've already revealed that there are Raspberry Pis running on my desk right now, there's a challenge with doing this with Raspberry Pis, which is that I don't get to assume that everybody out there has exactly the same sort of hardware setup. And setting up the hardware is fascinating. So what we're going to do is walk through how to get all of this working in the beginning using Docker containers that are running entirely inside my Mac. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a K3D cluster running in Docker in my Mac. And most of this should look fairly familiar to people in that we are creating a cluster. We're explicitly telling it that we want it to connect to a network called MeshExp. Say that 10 times fast. This is the usual stuff that I tend to do to make it really easy to talk to a web browser. You'd use a web browser to talk to a GUI service running in my cluster. This is entirely new, and we will be talking more about this shortly. But what this is basically saying is, hey, K3D, not only do I want you to expose a couple of TCP ports, I want you to expose a UDP port also to the rest of the network. And then I do my usual thing of turning off traffic in the metric server because I don't really care about them right now. So let's get that going. You remember earlier I mentioned DNS? That UDP port has to do with DNS. I would also like to go further and point out, by the way, that just for the record, I personally consider any day where I have to think about DNS to be not an ideal day. So yeah. All right. So we're going to make sure we have the right version of Linkerd here. We are, in fact, running Edge 24.2.2. That's the latest and greatest. That's what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and install Linkerd into my cluster. This is one of the longer steps happening in here. So I am not going to ask Jason to tell his networking joke. But now would be a great time if anybody has other questions, or have you come up with something else to ask about, Jason?
Not right at the moment. So actually a little bit about your setup. So you've created a network for the K3D cluster to be on. And the assumption is that you're going to put the Docker containers that are going to be our external workloads on the same network. Is that the way that works?
Yep. Yeah, I actually let K3D create the network as it happens because it can do that for you. So, which is, it doesn't really matter. You could also type Docker create network on your own, but I happen to let K3D do it. Yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it on that front.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah. It is very important, though, that you do, in fact, connect all of your Docker containers to the right network to be able to talk to the cluster, or the demo falls flat on its face, nothing works, you tear your hair out, and of course, that would not be any form of personal experience there as I tell that. None whatsoever. Yeah.
You can do another episode on Flynn's horror stories.
Yeah, it was... I'm looking forward to publishing this solely, like publishing the source code and everything, almost solely so I can tell people, learn from my suffering. Yeah, there's most of this is not, I've said before, this is hard, right? That's not really right. It's not difficult. It's just that there are a very large number of details. And if you get any of them wrong, it gets really confusing really fast. All right, so we've got Linkerd up and running. I have pre-built the Docker images I'm using for this. The generic image that I've built is the one that has just, it's suitable for running in a Kubernetes cluster. It's just containing my one workload binary. That's all that's in there. So I'm going to go ahead and stuff that image into my K3D cluster because I didn't go and push it to any repos yet. Any registries, I really should go ahead and push those to some registries so that people can play with them.
We can make that part of getting the demo ready to be published.
Yeah. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a namespace called Faces. I'm using the world famous Faces demo for this, where you get to see lots of little cells that have smiling faces in them. And ideally, smiling faces on green backgrounds. That's what you're supposed to see in the web browser. The wrinkle that I'm going to do here is I'm only going to run the Faces workload in the cluster, and Smiley and Color are going to be running outside the cluster. So I'm first going to create my namespace called Faces. And the only particularly interesting thing here is that I'm marking it for automatic injection when it gets created. So there we go with that. Here's my GUI. It's not very profound. I'm just showing this in case anybody's curious. This is creating our service. And then we get to have a deployment, which references my generic image and does not pull. There's another detail. Learn from my suffering. If you've loaded an image into K3D, but you accidentally leave the image pull policy set to always, it will ignore the fact that you've loaded it into K3D and try to pull it from someplace, and then it will break and the world will come to an end. So yeah, don't do that. And then the rest of this is just stuff for running the GUI service. The GUI workload within Faces is the one that actually serves HTML to the browser. It doesn't do much, but what it does do is pretty important. Same thing for the Face workload. We have a Face service. We've got a Face deployment. Same image, but we are now setting the Faces service variable to be Face instead of GUI. I normally, when we're playing with Faces, we deliberately set this error fraction so things break. And in this case, I actually don't want to do that. I am not particularly showing off the reliability stuff right now. I'm showing off how you can run things outside the cluster, so I don't need it to break. Okay, so we can get that going. And we can wait for our stuff to come up. There we go. And yeah, so we have the GUI and we have the Face workload and we have nothing else. So if we go over to our GUI right now, then what's going to happen is we will see a bunch of cursing faces on gray backgrounds, which is not what we're supposed to see when this is working correctly. But the reason that we're seeing that is that we don't have a smiley workload and we don't have a color workload. So when the browser asks the Face workload to give it a cell, the Face workload throws up its hands into despair because it can't actually talk to anything. So this is not good, but it is expected. Next up, there's a lot of text in here. Hold on to your hats or something. We're going to run Smiley and Color in Docker containers attached to the same Docker network, but not inside the cluster. And there are a lot of moving parts in this one. The first one is we need Spire and the Linkerd proxy in the container, as well as having our workload in the container. Now, the biggest way that this demo cheats is that we actually run a Spire agent as well as, we run a Spire server as well as a Spire agent in the container. Don't do this. This is a bad idea. The way this is supposed to work is that you run the Spire agent in the container and it talks to a Spire server someplace else, and you've got this whole attestation thing.
And
go ahead.
Flynn, just for clarification, the reason we're doing all this, the reason we've loaded all these things into this container image is because in our example, we're pretending that this container that you're building is a virtual machine that's being joined to our Kubernetes cluster, effectively.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, I actually, some of the development of this has come out of work that I've been doing with some of the guys at SUSE, where the Internet of Things is a thing. And when we talk about doing this on real hardware, I'm still going to do it with a Docker image. And the reason for that is that I personally kind of like to be able to tear down the Docker image and have all of the madness of IP tables and stuff just cleanly go away. So that's really nice. But yeah, if you don't want to do this in images, you can absolutely take a virtual machine or a real machine and just stick the Spire agent on there by hand, and then put your workload on there by hand, and then, have stuff that runs the right IP table stuff.
Great.
But I'm doing it in a Docker image, both because that way I get to run it inside Docker on my Mac, and also because it makes it a little bit easier for other people to reproduce what we're doing here once we publish the sources. But let me back up once again to emphasize the way you normally work with Spire and SPIFFE in the real world is you run a Spire agent on your workload, and that Spire agent goes out and talks to a Spire server. And we are cheating massively on this particular bit. The next time I run this demo, I said this last time and then a bunch of other stuff got in the way, but the next time I run this demo, I really, really want the Spire agent to also be not running, the Spire server to not be running in my workload anymore. Because it is a brutal hack and we can do better. All right, so I've built, again, an image called faces-generic here that takes my workload and copies in the Spire agent and copies in the Spire server and basically just sticks them all in the right place so it'll come up and start running things. The magic here is not really in building these images, it's in the bootstrap process that the image goes through, and we will talk about that in a minute. All right. The next thing that's interesting is that we need to be able to route from our Docker container to the pod CIDR range inside the cluster so that we can go through and interact with things like the Linkerd control plane. Some very interesting things happen if you forget this step as well. And I actually have a goal as well. I want to figure out a way to route less than the whole CIDR range. And so that'll be fun to go through and look at a little bit more later too. Okay, but we can fetch the node IP, by which I mean the IP address of the physical node that's running our single node K3D server here. That IP address is obviously not in the pod CIDR range. The pod CIDR range is where we assign cluster IPs for services and things like that. But the node has a distinct IP, and from outside the node, we can use the node's IP to route through to get to the pod CIDR range. So that was all about setting those variables. We can read those out of Kubernetes, and so we do that. And now let us talk about DNS. Thank you, Buoyant. That was very helpful. Also on spiffy.io, you can find a book called, was it The Zeroth Turtle? That is useful. Really, it is. Maybe it was Zero the Turtle. All right, we'll find the link and put it up there. Okay, DNS. What's that DNS haiku? It's not DNS. No, I could remember it. It's not DNS. There's no way it's DNS. It's DNS. It was DNS. DNS is a pain. What we're going to do here is we have two options with DNS. The first one is, because remember, we have running in Kubernetes, we have a DNS server that is capable of resolving all of the addresses that are relevant inside this cluster. And one of our options, which is the way we did this for Cloud Native Live, was we just allowed the pods, or allowed our external machines to route all the way through to the Kubernetes DNS server. And there's a problem with that, which is that the Kubernetes DNS server doesn't have an address in the pod CIDR range. It has an address in the service CIDR range. If you allow routing directly into the service CIDR range, you're kind of breaking some of the isolation that you really want with a cluster. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to edit the service for the kubedns service itself, and we are going to make that a node port service. We are explicitly going to nail it to node port 30,000. If we do this, then we can route DNS requests to our node IP on port 30,000, and they will get answered correctly. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when we get to talk about real hardware as well. So if we do that, we can now see in here that this says, oh yeah, this is also on node port 30,000, so we can talk to it. Being able to forward things this way gives us two things. The first one is it gives us a way to resolve addresses inside the cluster, but maybe more importantly, it gives us a way on real hardware where we can set up things to control access to this. Actually, I guess I'll talk about it now. In real hardware, I have a DNS mask instance running on the node that is also running my Kubernetes cluster. And it's set up so that it will forward service.cluster.local to the port 30,000 DNS server, but it won't forward anything else. And so that turns out to be a fairly, that's an elegant start to that. We could also go down the rabbit hole of DNSSEC and things like that, but let's not do that. And at some point in the future, hopefully, we might be able to use Linkerd for that too. That would be really cool. The last thing that needs to happen in terms of what happens with our external workload is that it actually has to run the Linkerd proxy. And the Linkerd proxy has to be able to connect to the Linkerd control plane, and it needs an identity, and it needs DNS. So for identity, we're going to use Spire, which is why we've got the running Spire agent. And for DNS, or rather for finding the control plane, the way this is set up right now, it's actually going to use the ability to resolve a service name for the Linkerd control plane so that it can just connect that way, and it relies on DNS for that. Did that make any sense, Jason?
It did. There's a lot going on. I won't lie to you.
There is a lot going on.
We did get a point of clarification from somebody in the comments. So when we talk about SPIFFE and Spire, SPIFFE is like a framework for how you do this identity stuff, and Spire is a specific implementation of the SPIFFE protocol, right? So that's what we're doing in this case. We're using a Spire agent to allow our individual workloads to say, I am who I say I am, by talking to a Spire server that says, okay, you are who you say you are, and then generates it that MTLS certificate. And we use that to communicate back with Linkerd. Is that about right, Flynn?
That's pretty much exactly right.
Hey, there we go.
Nicely done. The process of going to the Spire server and saying, here's who I am, verify me, is called attestation in Spire land, or maybe in SPIFFE land. I am not quite sure.
SPIFFE
land. The division between those two is a little bit weird sometimes. There's an interesting chicken and egg problem there, right? Where you have a workload that comes up and talks to your server and says, hey, this is who I am. And you have to have some way to know that you trust who they are. How do you do this, right? This is the book I mentioned about the turtles comes from the old joke about somebody giving an astronomy lecture and a little old lady coming up and saying, oh yeah, we all know that the world is carried around on the back of a turtle for real. And the guy says, oh yeah, well, what does that turtle stand on? Another turtle. And then eventually, the punchline is it's just turtles all the way down. But at some point you have to have something to rely on. Running the Spire server and the Spire agent on the same machine lets us effectively fake that process out by generating the magic that lets the server know that the agent is good on the machine so that the agent can just read it and spit it back to the server. This is why you don't do this in production, because it's effectively undermining a really key component of identity. All right. And yes, lots of moving parts. So this is not a thing that you want to bootstrap by hand. It can be done, but don't rely on it. Okay, here's the bootstrap script. It is deceptively short. There's a lot going on, but it ends up being not a ton of code. So the way this works, and we're going to go through this in a minute, it runs the Spire server and then it runs the Spire agent. It tells the Spire server, please give me an identity. Please create an identity for me. It starts our workload running after we have an identity. It configures IP tables, and then it starts the proxy running. Easy, right? Or something like that. So
it's comprehensible, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to use easy for any of this, but
so it's short enough that we're just going to go look through it. I'm going to remind everybody one more time. Please do not take this script and run it in production and go, but Flynn said this was okay. Here you have Flynn saying, this is not okay in production. It's good enough for our demo here, good enough for what we're doing right now. And we will be working on cleaning this up more. But yeah. Okay. So first things first, we have a stack of environment variables that we need to set, because when you are running a workload outside the cluster, when you go and talk to Linkerd, you need to tell it how it's going to appear from inside the cluster. So you need a name and a namespace, and the node name is kind of just the chunk of hardware that belongs to this for identification purposes. Since we are going to run a Spire server in here, the Spire server needs certificates that it has access to. And I'd like to point out, this right here is the biggest reason why this is not okay in production. The way the Spire world works within Linkerd, the Spire server and the Linkerd running in your cluster have to share a common root of trust. So we basically have to give the Spire server access to Linkerd's trust anchor. I think it might work if we give it access to something that signs the Linkerd trust anchor, but I haven't yet tested that, so don't take that as gospel. If you're doing this correctly, this means you're going to generate your Spire server. You're going to generate your trust anchor using something like Vault, and then you're going to run the Spire server next to a place where it can use Vault to grab it, or maybe it's running on the same machine as Vault. That would make a certain amount of sense. Maybe Vault actually has a Spire server built into it. I need to look into that. That would be interesting. Since we're doing this the wrong way, we're just going to require you to mount the private key of the trust anchor in your Docker container. The first time we did this, we actually copied it into the Docker image. That would be even worse. At least now we're mounting it into the container. So we use those to construct the SPIFFE ID that will belong to this workload. And the name of that thing is important, I believe. Next up, we start our Spire server running. And shall we look for a second at the Spire config? Let's not, because I really don't want to. I don't really want to really emphasize these configurations right now. But yeah, so we're going to start the Spire server running. We're going to give it a chance to stabilize, and then we use Spire server token generate. Say that 3 times fast. To grab the token with which the agent will authenticate to our server. We stick it in an environment variable so that we can instantly pass it on the command line to the Spire agent. Then we give the rest of the system a little bit of a chance to stabilize, because the agent and the server both need to be running. The agent has to go and get its act together and talk to the server. And then finally, we ask the Spire server, hey, please create an entry that is parented by the agent that ultimately has the ID that we set up here based on the name of our workload. This business with this selector is basically saying the only way that we're going to allow you to get access to this is if you're running as root in the Unix world. And that's the biggest reason why I haven't gone ahead and split this stuff out, because if you're putting the Spire server on another host, you can't use this, which means I have to understand enough about it to be able to move it over and replace the selector. And yeah,
So the expectation is that if I'm running this in production later, right, I'm relying on one of Spire's other attestation methods to say I am who I say I am, but I still want to generate a SPIFFE ID that looks like the one that you've described, right?
Absolutely.
And that will allow me to participate in the mesh. Is that about right?
Yeah. And there's another subtlety in here that we didn't talk about in Cloud Native Live because I didn't fully understand it at the time, which is that this is creating an entry for this SPIFFE ID on the server, but it's not loading it into the agent or anything like that. Much later, what happens is that the Linkerd proxy talks to the agent and asks it, hey, here's my identity. Do you have an entry for me? And the agent goes, oh, hey, you're talking to me over Unix. This, over a Unix domain socket, you must be okay. And it hands over the identity for it.
Great.
So there is definitely some subtlety in what's going on here. Even running this in production, you will absolutely have a Spire agent running next to your workload. And your workload will then talk to the Spire agent to get the identity. The server is going to be someplace else. And that creation step is going to happen completely out of band, which is if you're running 2 workloads, no big deal. If you're running 10,000 on a factory floor, there's a little bit of an automation issue that you might want to address, right?
Well, this is part of what allows your security team to use something like Spire to decide, what things should be allowed to get up and join the mesh, right? So you have that whole access control pattern.
Yep. And there are ways that you can go through and do things like, as I understand it, there are ways you can sort of indirect where you can say, oh, they've got such and such a token. Well, we'll allow them to create an identity under this particular domain, stuff like that. So Spire is pretty cool, or SPIFFE is pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff in there that we've just started exploring, or at least the part of we that's, me and probably Jason. There's the engineering folks have already had to explore a fair amount of this stuff. Once we get the Spire agent and the Spire server all set up, we can go ahead and start the workload. The workload, importantly, does not have to actually deal with Spire and all that directly because it's going to rely on the Linkerd proxy to do it. Once that happens, we do a bunch of IP table stuff. I am not going to go through this. It's literally ripped out of what Linkerd does when it comes up in Kubernetes. And so we're just going to pretend that that is a black box. And finally, we set a stack of environment variables that the Linkerd proxy is going to want. And we run the proxy. Run proxy is a script that sets another slew of boilerplate environment variables and then just literally calls the Linkerd proxy and runs it. So that's it. 70 lines, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in there. Any other questions or comments or whatever?
None from the chat right now.
Okay.
Let's see it start.
Yeah, that'll be good, right? Okay. So there's the Smiley workload. And if we take a look through this, Docker run, we're going to kill this container once it dies. We're going to run it detached in the background. We're going to give this container the name Smiley. It needs the netadmin capability so that it can do things like mess with IP tables. I'm waiting on this to finish scrolling. Okay, good. It needs to be connected to our MeshExp network. It can go talk to the IP server running over on our node, the DNS server running on our node. And we're kind of cheating here. The fact of the matter is that the DNS server running on the node, just using the node's IP has access to do this, which is good. We're going to mount certificates into OptSpire certs. We're going to set the environment variables that we need. And then finally, we will set, these environment variables are needed by the Bootstrap to go through and set things up properly. These environment variables are needed for phases to run a Smiley workload. We're not going to set the error fraction, but we are going to slow things down. Finally, we give it an image, and then as soon as it's running, we jump in and route the pod cider via the node. And we do exactly the same thing for color. And we can see that they are running, which is a good thing. That is not enough, though, to be able to talk to these things. The reason it's not enough to be able to talk to these things is that we don't have Kubernetes services, and we don't have anything like that that acts like a deployment, right? There's nothing in our cluster to tell it how to talk to these external workloads. For that, we use a new Linkerd resource called, in a fit of originality, external workload. They're kind of like Kubernetes deployments. So you create a service that references this thing, and then you create an external workload that doesn't cause Kubernetes to run any code. It just tells Linkerd, here's where you find this thing. So what we're going to do is first, we're going to grab the IP address of the Docker container running the Smiley workload, which happens to be 172.24.0.2. And then we're going to fill in the name Smiley and the IP address that we just found in our external workload template. And we end up with an external workload that looks like this. So its name is Smiley. It lives in the faces namespace. It has some labels so that services can bind to it. Here's some new stuff. We explicitly specify this is the name of the identity that we have, and this is our server name. And this server name in this case is not the name of a server resource in a Linkerd server resource. That is the name that Linkerd expects to see as a SAN in the identity certificate that it gets back when it goes and messes with Spire and all that. And we tell it, oh yeah, you can find this thing at 172.24.0.2. One note here, that is an array because eventually you'll be able to do an IPv4 address and an IPv6 address. Do not think that you can run stacks of containers and then fill in 8 different IP addresses. That will not work. This is the usual. We have a port called HTTP. It's running on port 8000. This is different. When you create things, you don't normally fill in the status. This is there so that the Linkerd external workload controller knows which external workloads are to be considered ready. And in production, you would probably create it without the status and then have something doing health checking that's updating the status of your external workload. We're just going to create it and fill in the status and hope for the best. And then finally, we have a service, also named Smiley, that does exactly the same thing, except that it's selecting for a workload name of Smiley, which matches up with our workload name of Smiley up here. And that's all there is to it. So we can go ahead and apply that. And again, we'll do exactly the same thing for color, where the only difference with this stuff is you will see names like color, and you'll see color in the identity, and you see a different IP address. And the server looks the same. Okay.
So it looks like, Flynn, there's a lot of, as you look to do mesh expansion, right? Like as a consumer of Linkerd, what we're saying is there's a lot of automation that you're going to require around this to make it work smoothly.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I figure that so first off, part of the plan here is that if you are running Buoyant Enterprise Linkerd, then it's going to be able to help out with more of this stuff than we get to do with open source Linkerd, right? But also, it probably could be fun to go and do a Buoyant Brown Bag seminar where we dive more into some of these details too, right?
Great.
Because yeah, there's a lot of stuff. If you're doing this for 2 or 3 workloads, you see the level of effort involved. If you are doing it again for 10,000 things out on a factory floor, then life could be interesting. So we have some services. Yay. The Faces GUI is our only load balancer because it's the only one we really need to talk to from outside the cluster. And we can also go and take a look at the external workloads. Our external workloads end up defining endpoint slices in Kubernetes. And it's a little bit interesting here. If we look at the face endpoint slices, this was actually created by the Kubernetes endpoint controller, which only knows how to notice services when it's filling in your endpoint IPs. If we look down here, we can see that there is a thing that looks like that for Smiley and Color, and they have no endpoints. And the reason is that's the Kubernetes endpoint controller creating that slice, and there is no pod behind this. Sorry, I think I said services about the endpoint controller earlier. I should have said pods. So since there are no pods associated with our Smiley service, then the Kubernetes endpoint controller says, dude, there are no endpoints. But there's also a Linkerd endpoint controller now, and it creates these other things clearly identified as Linkerd external, and they do have endpoints reflecting the IP addresses of our Docker containers. And if we go to the browser at this point, it should be working. Woohoo! It's working. Is this gonna work?
So now,
Yes.
we're seeing here, just so I've got it right, is we're seeing the front end, which is loaded in Kubernetes, talking to two backend services, right? The color service and the the color pod. Oh, I'm sorry, the color VM
workload.
and
the color workload running in a Docker container that's outside the cluster, and the Smiley workload running in a Docker container that's outside the cluster.
And from the perspective of the front end, it's calling to Kubernetes services.
Yeah.
So it's calling to, if we look at the application setup, you're going to see the front end calling to faces.face, maybe faces.faces. Service.cluster.local. Sorry, now I've got a ton of questions. This is really cool. Folks, if you have any questions about this, please ask them in the chat or over in the workshop channel over on Slack, and I'll put that Slack link up again, so you can see
everybody gets to see why I do most of these scripted, because I was having such a lovely time figuring out where exactly the HTML. This is actually, This is actually the code that is running underneath the GUI. And if anybody has ever wondered how horrible this stuff is, it's pretty horrible.
And then we have a question from Patrick over in the chat asking about when will Linkerd 2.15 be released?
Oh, I'm sorry. I just realized I'm totally looking at the wrong thing here. That's why I couldn't find it. Linkerd 2.15 is supposed to be coming very soon now.
So like imminently, basically.
Yeah, I believe so.
So everything waits, like things get released when the team is ready to release it, right? So we can't tell the engineering team when something is done.
Yeah.
But they believe they're very close.
Man, I wish we could tell the engineering team when they were done.
I don't need that kind of power.
That would be very bad, for the record. So what's happening is that the GUI is making a single call to the face workload, and it can do that because basically because the GUI will relay, if it sees a path of /face, it will relay that into the face workload. So it's literally making a call to face.faces as a service at cluster.local. And the face server is the one that actually makes the other calls. And unless you say otherwise, which we did not, it is literally making calls to Smiley and Color, and just letting DNS resolution do the right thing to fill in the service.cluster.local part. And, there you go. That's the URL.
Great. So yeah, so we're routing. So from the perspective of this web front end, it's calling to two Kubernetes services.
Yep.
And what's really happening is that you're getting from the front end pod a mesh connection to these two external workloads. And those two external workloads are, I've got mutual TLS, I've got observability, I've got Linkerd's reliability features connecting in and getting me that web front end.
Yeah, it's one of those things where one of the difficult things about demoing it is that it doesn't look like anything because it just works, which is really cool. And like you were mentioning, you were talking about some of the reliability stuff. So one of the fun things that we can do here is we can start Smiley 2 and Color 2 running in our cluster. These are exactly the same, except that Smiley 2 will return hard-eyed smileys. And Color 2 will return the color blue instead of green. We can get those going. And then we can use an HTTP route to do a canary between Smiley and Smiley 2, even though Smiley is not in the cluster and Smiley 2 is in the cluster. And you can see that there you go. There's like 20% of things that have hard-eyed smileys.
So the Linkerd proxies are treating, the external workloads just as if they're Kubernetes workloads. So the normal stuff we get to do with our Kubernetes workloads is working.
Yeah. We can also do our usual fun things like we can go and edit these and make it a 50-50 split. And we will just see that happen on the fly. Or we can go through and, whoops, that didn't work well. Just for the fun of it, let's turn it into a 90-10 split so that most of the traffic is going back to outside the cluster. So the fact that the workload is external doesn't really matter how Linkerd can interact. It doesn't really affect how Linkerd can interact with them, which is one of the really cool things going on in here.
Great. Now we have some questions. So, someone wants to know if they're using something like Small Step for the identities and they don't currently have anything that works with SPIFFE and Spire. Where do they stand today?
In fact, the CA.cert and CA.key that I'm using in this demo, I pretty much generated with the Small Step CLI.
Okay.
I'm not going to lie. I generated them using a Go program where I linked in the Small Step Go packages because I didn't want to type as much by hand. But yeah, it's the short version is that once we publish the demo stuff, you'll be able to use it. And the longer version is, that's a lovely question. We'll let you know more about how to set up a Spire server for real as soon as we know it.
Yeah, and then just a little bit to add on to that, as you have particular use cases, like we'd love to hear more about what you're doing. So please get involved with the project. Look at what we're doing on GitHub and bring things up. This is the beginning of the mesh expansion journey, and it's an open source project. So as you provide feedback to us and use cases, we're able to improve it to better support you. So we'd love to hear more. We had another question. So any plans for external workloads to connect to a workload inside a Kubernetes cluster if the IP address of that external workload is changing frequently?
I
know that's a lot, but I've read it a few times.
IP address of the external workload. The IP address of the external workload shouldn't really affect much. Or were they asking from the cluster to the external workload if it's IP address? Okay. If your external workload is changing IP addresses reaching into the cluster, then I think the limiting factor is going to be probably updating the external workload resource for Linkerd to know how to interact with it.
Yeah, I think in either case, right? It's the automation around how do you create that external workload that needs to be solved for.
I haven't really thought about that very much, actually. That's a kind of an interesting one. So, anything else before I go on to other stuff?
Looks okay for now. Oh, wait, sorry, I'm missing some more things in chat. But no, looks like we're okay.
Cool. So this is now the part where I accidentally showed this at the beginning instead of getting to do the big reveal. So my inner showman is just lying on the floor, curled up in a ball, crying. But one of the things that I wanted to do with this is to show, we were talking about small devices. So there are 3 of these things. This is a Raspberry Pi 4. I don't actually remember how much RAM these have right now. I think they're the 4 gig versions. Don't remember. The reason it's a Raspberry Pi 4 is actually not so much that you need the processor muscle that a Raspberry Pi 4 has. It's that you need a 64-bit processor. And so if you try to run this on a Raspberry Pi 1, you're going to be in a world of hurt because it doesn't have much RAM, but it also has a 32-bit CPU. You can't really see it, but over here, I guess you can kind of see one over here. This is another Pi 4. And in the back, kind of behind this one, is yet another Pi 4. This one that has no case, that's sitting way in the back, is actually running a single node K3S cluster. Please note I said K3S, not K3D. Originally, when I was going to do this demo, I was going to go and I was going to run a cluster on my Macintosh inside Docker, and then I was going to use the Pis as the external workloads. And the fact that there's an additional layer of network involved between my Macintosh and Docker proved very, very painful. And at the point that I realized I was going to be messing with the routing table on my Macintosh to try to do a 2-layer routing through this thing, I kind of went, nope, I'm going to run it in K3S on the Pi so that the networking is simpler.
Seems smart.
The reason that I'm running the external workloads on Pis is that, you remember I said the Internet of Things is kind of important. One of the things that's kind of fun about the Internet of Things is going through and, actually being able to interact with hardware. So one of the things that we get to do with this one is, so like this is running the Smiley workload, and this is running the color workload. And if I go through and change this knob, then you will start see it doing red and green now, because turning the knob changes the error fraction. And if I set this up right, then we get to see that. So if I come over here and turn this one up, then you will see some gray colors show up. And if I turn them back down to 0, then you should see all of them go away.
That's pretty cool.
And then just for the fun of it, if you push down, then it just latches them into the error state and everything fails. And the reason for that is that I was going to show off some circuit breaking, but I did not get to that in time. So I apologize. But part of the point here is just that, you can actually do this with real hardware. Our original question was, how small is small? And okay, so at this point, you've got a Kubernetes cluster running in about, what do we have over there? 25 watts of power. And I think that I ended up spending, when I bought, I had a shocking amount of this stuff literally lying around the house. So I think I'm in under $200 all told, and that's only because Raspberry Pis are stupid expensive right now. Thank you very much, COVID supply chain stuff. So you can do some cool things with very small amounts of hardware. Most of this is exactly the setup that we saw in the earlier part of the demo. These are not running the Faces generic image. They're running one called Faces Pi, because Faces generic doesn't draw in the code to be able to interact with the Pi hardware, because I don't want to go and figure out what happens when I run that on stuff that's not a Pi right before a demo, right? So it's easier to just run the right code. The other thing is that like I said, I'm running on this Pi all the way in the back. I am running doing this with a flipped camera, non-flipped camera is really hard. On this one, I'm actually running a DNS mask server as well, because that let me both allow the Pis to be able to pull images from the outside internet and allow them to forward just service.cluster.local into the Kubernetes cluster. And since we are still running Linkerd, one fun trick we can do is we can go snoop on the network and find out whether or not these are sending clear text or not. And the answer is not. This turns out to be really hard to do in a meaningful way with Docker networks. And so it's really fun to be able to do it with actual real, networks going on here. If you are,
and so everything is encrypted. So if I'm running a Linkerd proxy,
MTLS, baby,
I've got MTLS all the way to my workload.
Yeah,
that's pretty nice.
Yeah, it's really cool. And we can also do things like this is now. You can't see me turning the knob, but you can see the effect. So that browser window is now showing me the stuff running in the Pi cluster. You didn't see it, but my demo quickly flipped my kube config partway through here.
Flynn, a quick question. Does that mean that we get things like circuit breaking, Linkerd's endpoint selection, retries, timeouts? We get that for our non-Kubernetes workloads as well?
Yeah.
So an external workload proxy is a proxy kind of deal.
Yeah.
Great.
In fact, I'm going to do the thing here where I show canarying using the stuff running on the Pi, right? So once I apply this one, then we should see some of these start to show up with the blue background.
So we're now doing a canary between.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, we're doing a canary between. So if you look closely, you'll also see that this one in the back is blinking a lot less than the one in the front. That's because half the traffic is not going to this Pi anymore. It's going to the other end in the cluster. Arguably, I ought to set this up so that it's actually canarying between the two Pis. That might have been a better demo. If I come over here, then I can do my usual trick of, oh wait, that's not what I wanted. Yeah. This is supposed to be a 50-50 split. We'll do the 80-20 so that most of it is going back onto the Pi. And if I come back over here, then you can see this one blinking more often than it was a second ago. And all the blue should go away. Again, that's running on a bunch of Raspberry Pis, just hanging out doing their thing.
Okay.
So that's it for the demo. Questions are great. We are at an hour, so if people want to do less time, then we won't be terribly offended.
Yeah, so we do have one outstanding question, but we've got some clarifications back to them to try and understand what they're asking. If you have questions that we didn't address live, please catch up with us in the workshops channel. We would love to answer things asynchronously as we go.
Yeah. I suppose we could, well, I was going to say we could try and see what happens if we do retries, but let's not.
Okay, yeah, I think we'll stick with it here. So there are a couple questions to follow up with in chat later, and folks will get to you there. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time. Flynn, thank you so much for a really cool demo.
Thanks. I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah. All right, everybody.
Yeah. Sounds good. Appreciate it. We'll be back with more, and hope to see y'all at another Service Mesh Academy or one of our new B-Cubes. Let me make sure. Let's see. We mentioned Buoyant Enterprise for Linkerd. Go to buoyant.io/enterprise-linkerd for more. The point of Buoyant Enterprise Linkerd is to go through and take a bunch of this fairly complex stuff and make it less complex to work with. So you should check that out. It's pretty cool. We still have our fundamentals of the service mesh online, learn.buoyant.io, or scan the QR code. And yeah, I guess that's it.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Enjoy.